think. Okay then, so let's start. I would like to welcome you to our first webinar of the hybrid project, which stands hybrid warfare and the EU cybersecurity. I am Ethem İlbiz. I'm the principal investigator of the hybrid project and also senior research fellow at the University of South Wales in International Center for Policing and Security. This project is a Jean Monnet module co-funded by European Commission and the European Education and Cultural Executive Agency. Our project aims to contribute to the critical debates on cybersecurity threats, EU and NATO policies from a hybrid warfare perspective. Today, we are privileged to host our first guest speaker, Andrew Mumford. He is one of the esteemed academics in this research field. Andrew is a professor of war studies in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. He is also one of the experts of the EU-NATO Hybrid Threat Center of Excellence, and he is consulting with the UK Ministry of Defence and NATO on issues related with the hybrid warfare. His latest book, The West's War Against the Islamic State, was published in 2021. He is also the editor of the IB Tauris book series, Studies in Contemporary Warfare. So before handing over the floor to Andrew, I would like to remind you that we will have a Q&A session after his 30 minutes presentation. Please do not hesitate to ask your questions. You can type your questions on Q&A box. And if you want to ask in person, just raise your hand and I would like to enable your camera and microphone to allow your question, ask your question. So without a further ado, I would like to give the floor to Andrew to share his insights on this interesting but also controversial topic. Floor is yours.
Ethem, thank you very much indeed for that introduction and also as well for the invitation to come and speak to you this afternoon. It's very well timed actually, because only a couple of weeks ago I came back from Helsinki, having spent a few days visiting the EU-NATO Countering Hybrid Threat Center, where I was able to sort of talk to a much greater extent with those who spend their day job thinking about the various different facets of hybrid action in the international arena, including the way in which cyber is utilized and leveraged as a hybrid threat. But what I'd like to do with you guys this afternoon is to try and establish a couple of fundamentals. And that is essential because I can think of very few other typologies of conflict that are debated at such an existential level as the concept of hybrid war is. If you think about other typologies of war in the international system, proxy war, or you cast your mind back to the previous decade, we spent a lot of time talking about counterinsurgency war because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those concepts, those typologies of war were not rigorously debated by academics about the nature of their very existence. We accepted the premise of the existence of these typologies and then had large debates about the direction that they should take, the practical solutions. Hybrid conflict is very different. As I'm sure you're already aware, there are huge levels of debate surrounding the concept. So what I would like to do is to sort of stake my claim to try and think about where and why we how and why we can frame hybrid war in the wider taxonomy of conflict, as well as trying to think about its practical application and what we can do about it. One of the I think fundamental reasons why so much of the academic controversy has existed is because there are so many different labels that have been associated with it. Although hybrid war or hybrid threats is now the most commonly used piece of terminology. Trying to narrow down even a keyword search for a basic literature review is very difficult because of the panoply of different labels and phrases that have been used instead. Vicarious warfare, non-linear warfare, non-obvious warfare, grey zone conflicts, sub-threshold conflicts, and there are more as well. So part and parcel of the problem about defining hybrid war is one about agreement on basic label itself. And that's part and parcel of the question. The reason why I think it's important to dwell just a little bit longer on this issue of definition is precisely because for many critics of the concept, the reason why they are so critical of it is that they accuse those who are pushing the idea that we're simply trying to put old wine in new bottles, that there is nothing new intrinsically in hybrid war, that there have been the fundamental tenets of this type of conflict, the ambiguous use of force across a multiplicity of different platforms that embraces both conventional, unconventional, regular, irregular types of conflict, has been as old as war itself. And then even if you think about certain wars that you associate specifically with conventional warfare, say like World War II, you will also find within that stories that have important ramifications for certain theatres of operations that relied on unconventional force, say the use of partisan guerrillas in Yugoslavia or Greece, for example. However, I think that it's more important to frame hybrid war not as a new type of war, but just as a new way of thinking about war. I'm not going to stand here and claim that hybrid war is something brand new. I accept the point of the critics that hybridity in conflict is as old as war itself. But for me, where I stand on this, and this is an idea that I want to share with you today and look forward to receiving any questions about, is that what has changed is that despite the prevalence of hybridity in conflict for centuries, we have never reached a stage that we are at now, whereby the hybridity of the force has rendered such a strategic level of effect. And that for me is why it's interesting and important to think about why contemporary wars are being fought more ambiguously in the so-called grey zone than ever before. I'm not going to be so brave as to tell you my own personal definition of hybrid war. I don't think that that's necessarily helpful, but I think it's important to at least identify the component characteristics of it. I would say that hybrid war consists of hostile actions that are difficult for a state to identify, attribute, or publicly define as coercive uses of force. And within those, within that sentence there, we are seeing what I think to be some of the central characteristics of the war. Firstly is the fact that hybridity through the ambiguous use of force places a huge problem on the issue of attribution on behalf of the target. And this is why it has held such an appeal for many norm-challenging states in the international order. And I think it's important also to bear in mind that such conflicts are multi-causal, that they take place in multi-threat environments, and they do not have to rely on kinetic means alone. And this is why I think we are entering a brave new world of conflict, precisely for the combination of these reasons. That the regular and strategic leverage of the ambiguous use of force that is hard to attribute and is regularly, more often than not, non-kinetic is something that has not been the norm before, and we are now having to adapt to. But when trying to think about what hybridity looks like in contemporary war, I would point you to two things. I think it's important that we think about the hybridity of the source of the threat and the hybridity of methods. So the hybridity of source is my way of trying to encompass the fact that hybrid war doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires and leans on and brings in multiple different types of force use. This can include, if we're talking about sources, the utility of proxies. It can be the utility of cyber attacks alongside conventional kinetic force. So the source of the attack can come along multiple lines. And that is compounded by the hybridity of method. So we see, we can point to the, as I've mentioned before, the simultaneous use of regular, irregular, conventional and unconventional within the same battle space against the same target for the same strategy, to try and achieve the same strategic goals. And that, I think, is part and parcel of trying to understand where hybridity lies when thinking about the label. But when we sort of take a step back and we think about, well, why would competitor states in the international system use hybrid force? Why, to briefly just touch on a few of the higher profile examples, why did Russia decide to render a hybrid war strategy in Crimea in 2014? Why would China try and render a hybrid strategy in regards to control of contested islands in the East and South China Sea? Well, for me, the embrace of hybrid strategies are twofold. Firstly, it's to inhibit the decision processes of an opponent. Essentially, the use of hybrid war, the use of ambiguous use of force that butts up against the legitimate threshold of response, it means that hybrid war is as much a psychological and political form of war as it does a military form of conflict. It puts your opposition on the horns of a dilemma. If you are operating exclusively in the grey zone, using force ambiguously in a non-attributable way, then you put your opponent on the horns of a dilemma. If they don't react, you get what you want. If they overreact, they look like the aggressor. And the second reason is it undermines the ability of an opponent or their allies to legitimate the use of force in response. This is part and parcel of, some of you might be familiar with the works of Thomas Schelling, who's a famous strategic studies scholar in the 1960s, and he utilized the analogy of salami slicing, and this is exactly what hybrid war does. That slicing away at the salami, the international community might not notice if little pieces start going missing one at a time. The analogy in the particular instance I'm thinking of would be Crimea in 2014. Instead of taking the whole of Ukraine, as they tried to do in 2022, 2014, salami slice. Take Crimea, annex it, non-attributable use of force, the so-called little green men without their insignia on, and then a referenda that seemingly justifies the actions. Salami slicing tactics, they undermines the ability of an opponent to legitimize a full-on response because the ambiguity with which the actions are undertaken problematize a legitimate reaction to it. So to this extent, I think hybrid war lends itself to use in situations where a state fears escalation from an opponent or doesn't wish to give the other state enough reason to aid an opponent. It drives a wedge between potential competitors in the international system and confuses them as to how to respond. The picture here on the left of this particular slide is typical of what I've just been talking about. This was a picture taken in Crimea in 2014 of what became known as the Little Green Men. The Russian forces, volunteers, the Kremlin insisted, all 10,000 of them, who were volunteers, holidaymakers, Putin claimed, who just so happened to travel to Crimea to protect the honor and the livelihoods of the Russian-speaking minority. It just so happens that they all happen to be wearing standard Russian issue uniforms, carrying Russian standard issue weapons, and coming out of Russian standard issue armored vehicles. But that precisely the fact that I can sit here and cynically point all of that out. Of course, we cannot forget the fact that the West's response to the annexation of Crimea was weak. The utility of the hybrid acquisition of Ukraine, precisely through these means that this picture demonstrates, put the West on the horns of a dilemma. They couldn't use force in response because this did not look like, nor from what the Kremlin was saying, sound like an officially sanctioned piece of Russian military action, although to all intents and purposes it was. And this is what made in 2014 Vladimir Putin's use of hybrid war in Crimea such a highly political and highly calculated form of conflict. And it was precisely the Russian annexation of Crimea which really proliferated the academic focus on hybrid war. Although I think I should also point out that Crimea was a bit of a red herring in some other aspects as well, because of the widespread misinterpretation of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. General Gerasimov, who still is the chief of the Russian General Staff, had written this piece of military doctrine, which was misinterpreted in the West as a Russian playbook for hybrid war, as the mainstay of Russia's military strategy going forward. That was not the case, which led to some of the critical backlash against hybrid war as a theory. I accept that that was a widespread misinterpretation. I happily caution against people assuming that hybrid war is the Russian way of war. It absolutely is not, as was demonstrated very brutally in February 2022. That does not mean, however, that the annexation of Crimea in 2014 will not forever be a sort of textbook example of what hybrid war looked like at that particular point in the 21st century. It also manifests academic interest because it came to symbolize how hybrid war was deliberately used by states to shape regional and international events by masking their intent. And this is why often it was the hybrid war label, hybrid threats label has been used by NATO member states to describe the behavior of competitors in the international order, particularly the CRINC nations, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. But the reason why it sort of became such a zeitgeist for modern conflict is because of the way in which hiding responsibility for military action sowed the seeds of confusion in the minds of enemy decision makers, that it blurred the lines between war and peace. It tried to blur the lines between truth and falsehood. And this is where the ambiguity of this particular type of conflict becomes so pervasive. There is a big reason why it appeals to those nations in particular, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, is that because the adoption of ambiguous use of force and great activity in the grey zone, it takes the immediate belligerency out of war, because of the way in which they are trying to hide, to obfuscate responsibility for what could be construed as an act of war. And therefore, by instead operating in the grey zone, in other words, operating up to everything including nudging against that threshold of legitimate response in the eyes of the international laws of armed conflict, the recourse to hybrid war is actually, I think, rather creative in strategic terms because of the way in which it makes strengths like surprise, deniability, out of weaknesses, such as economic constraints or very poor conventional military capabilities. As I said earlier, my sort of big thing, my big contribution to all of this is trying to frame ambiguity as the central characteristic of this particular form of conflict. And I argue that the ambiguity in war occurs these days when intention of your eventual end game, your objectives, and your involvement in the activity itself are masked. And this makes for very unclear lines of responsibility. It creates the possibilities for strategic surprise, which is precisely what makes them very difficult to counter. And I keep returning to this idea of calculated ambiguity. It was a phrase that first really entered the strategic lexicon back in the early 1990s. The then American Secretary of State, James Baker, was asked during many press conferences during the first Gulf War whether the United States would use tactical nuclear weapons against Iraqi armed forces in order to push them out of Kuwait. And Baker always refused to answer the question straight. He refused to confirm or deny. And later on, he argued that this was part of a deliberate campaign of what he called calculated ambiguity. He wanted to make Saddam Hussein think twice. That if he ruled them out, then he just gave Saddam Hussein a bit more wiggle room. But if he just left the question dangling, he hoped that that calculated ambiguity might make Saddam Hussein think twice. And I think this idea of calculated ambiguity is incredibly relevant to acts of modern hybrid war. The ambiguity of the origin of an action, whether a state is hiding behind multiple proxy servers during a cyber attack, or they're hiding behind so-called volunteers who do not have any insignia on their military uniforms, or they are using fishing vessels to fit with high-level electronic jamming equipment on the high seas. The ambiguity of origin, intent, and responsive measures all make for a type of war in which calculated ambiguity is central. And I've said before, it's not new, but I think we have never seen a level of strategic usage across states and non-state actors on different continents using this form of war. And all of this, for those of you, any postmodernists in the audience who are fans of Jean Baudrillard and his famous work, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, I've borrowed, by no means, you might have noticed, not a postmodernist, however, I've borrowed Baudrillard's title here to highlight some of the way in which hybrid warfare centralizes ambiguity to create what might seem like very postmodern forms of war. The annexation of Crimea did not take place because of the centrality of ambiguity to the conduct of that Russian military operation, the cloud of uncertainty that was deliberately constructed around it. In other words, who those actors were, whose orders they were acting under, whether the people of Crimea wanted them there or not. All of this allowed the Kremlin to act just below the threshold of legitimate retaliation. Although it should be said that one of the major consequences of the invasion, the annexation of Crimea, in between that event and the full-on invasion in 2022, was that NATO has worked incredibly closely with the Ukrainian military, who themselves did not cover themselves in glory in responding to the annexation in 2014. And NATO has helped overhaul the Russian military system, its structure, its training, and in part has come home to roost given the incredible levels of defense that the Ukrainian military has put up since the invasion. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the omnipresence of ambiguity has resulted in the perpetrators acting like the annexation hadn't taken place. And it was their adversaries were not being able to do much about it. This is the strange thing, is there's Putin claiming that this wasn't his doing, but at the same time accepting the outcome of the sham referenda as the legitimate will of the Crimean people. So it was this very strange, a very strange sort of almost postmodern form of conflict. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the centrality of calculated ambiguity to making this happen. So this is where perhaps this talk about what hybrid war looks like in broader terms dovetails with the particular interests and the central concerns of this project at the University of South Wales is focusing on, because of the way in which cyber is one of the several strands that make up hybrid threats. Cyber is one of many, but it is arguably one of the most important platforms upon which hybrid war can be waged, particularly given the fact that it's not just about waging cyber attacks, it's also about how social media, the internet, are the biggest platform for information, disinformation operations, I should say, psychological operations, etc., economic attacks, etc. So this was one thing actually that came out of my conversations the other week in Helsinki at the NATO EU Centre, was thinking about, well, if cyber offers such platforms to sow the seeds of discontent in a population, if cyber can effectively help spread disinformation campaigns, which, considering we're heading into the general election in the UK and a presidential election in the United States by the end of this year, we are going to be primed, and I think we're already seeing some of it already begin. What can be done? And I was struck by one of the colleagues at the centre saying how their analysis has demonstrated that two of the biggest bulwarks that can stem the spread of disinformation online is high levels of media literacy within a population, and secondly, high levels of trust between the public and its government. And I look at the UK, where the majority of the population now no longer gets its news from mainstream media, but instead gets it off social media. And you look at opinion polls pertaining to public levels of trust in government, and it frankly leaves me a little bit worried about the susceptibility of the UK population to widespread disinformation campaigns online. I finally just want to talk about the implications. There are many things that I could talk about, and I'll happily go into more detail in the Q&A, but I just want to talk about the implications of all of this. By both trying to tackle, and by that I mean both counter and, if possible, deter, and those are two separate things. Trying to counter hybrid threats is in part about adopting a resilience approach. How can we mitigate the effects of them? That's not the same as deterring them from happening in the first place. And this is part and parcel of a work package that I'm undertaking at the moment with the UK Ministry of Defence, which has involved conversations with the EU NATO Centre of Excellence and some other national governments across Europe, is about whether we need to perhaps be more on the front foot. The idea of trying to apply conventional means of deterrence to hybrid threats in the same way that you would apply conventional deterrence policy to, say, nuclear weapons just simply doesn't join up. So is there a way in which tackling hybrid threats would allow us to move from, say, a position of resilience where we mitigate the worst effects to deterrence where we try and stop them happening in the first place? Would be more proactive. But that's controversial, because one of the key things that is at the heart of hybrid war is a battle of ideas. And a large part of what makes hybrid conflict so difficult is that because it's not purely kinetic, it is therefore not purely about territory. A lot of the the way in which the multiple platforms upon which hybrid threats are manifest, including online, through disinformation campaigns, is that we see what is at stake here is not just territory, it's ideas, it's the values that underpin the so-called rules-based international order. And the point of trying to erode these norms is that by eroding norms, you can weaken rules. And if you weaken rules, you can manipulate the international system to your favor. And this is why focusing upon the actions of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea in particular, we can see how many of these hybrid strategies have manifested themselves. So that was just a very long-winded way of saying that when we try and think of ways to tackle or engage in hybrid war, states are essentially both perpetually committing to avoiding and committing to continuous conflict. That war in the grey zone is perpetual. I mean, I don't ever think we've truly lived in an era of either war or peace. But hybrid war is fought in the increasingly militarized grey area between war and peace, which looks like neither. And that's why I think it's important that we understand its characteristics and its dynamics. And remember this, and it's great to see so many of you here trying to wrap your head around the way in which hybrid threats are manifest, especially online. Is the final thought I want to leave you with is that war waged ambiguously really does put opponents on the horns of a dilemma. Overreaction looks preemptive and disproportionate. If it's very clear, if it's not clear who is responsible for an attack, which of course is the major appeal of using cyber as the delivery mechanism for your hybrid threat, because of the lines of ambiguity that bouncing an attack off multiple servers offers. But also the lack of a response leaves a state open to death by 1,000 cuts. And that is an important thing to remember in hybrid war. Hybrid war does not seek a knockout blow. Hybrid war deliberately seeks death by 1,000 cuts. And that's why all these various different component parts of it, including cyber, are really worth bearing in mind, not necessarily in their individual silos, but thinking about the individual component parts of hybrid war as contributing to a bigger overall strategy so that states, competitor states in the international system, can try and get their way without necessarily having to breach that threshold of response. Itam, I'm going to leave it there. I realise I've been talking for half an hour now, so I will. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for excellent presentation and sharing your insights with us. Anyone from the audience, if you want to ask a question in person, I can just unmute you and you can ask directly. Yes, Mike.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that really insightful discussion there on hybrid warfare and the introduction. I'm currently undertaking a PhD research project looking at disinformation and the spread of disinformation and how it can impact on individuals. And I've just wondered what your thoughts would be on this. Basically, what I've read so far, it appears the dominant Western literature on the subject is kind of focused on the what, as in the bad actor, whether it be one of the countries that you mentioned a little bit earlier on, for example. Do you see a gap in research in the impact on the individual? So in other words, the so what, the end product, and what do you see that looking like?
Yeah, no, I do, Mike. I do see a disconnect. And this is where that tension that I've just been talking about between a balance between resilience and deterrence, I think is particularly manifest in the disinformation realm, is that it becomes very clear that policymakers, we're keen to point out malicious actors and the sort of propagandistic things that they push out there. But I don't think there's enough attention for thinking about, well, how then do we increase the societal resilience to disinformation? I frankly, again, speaking amongst friends, don't think that the government has gone far enough in trying to create effective well, firstly, social media literacy amongst younger people, ensuring that younger people, particularly from school, are able to be a bit more savvy in trying to understand and interpret the media that they see out there. But also, as well, is trying to understand that disinformation can run away from the original state, that disinformation campaigns can take on a life of their own. And the example, I hadn't realized this, and I think I'm allowed to talk about this, is I hadn't realized do you remember a couple of months ago, the news was awash with stories about Paris and London hotel rooms being overrun with bed bugs? Remember that story? It was everywhere, and people then started to post on social media all these pictures of bed bugs in Paris and London hotels, and it was a huge thing that the papers lapped up. I hadn't realized that this whole story began as a Russian disinformation campaign. The original story was meant to be to provoke anti-Ukrainian refugee sentiment in the West, because the original disinformation stories that had been put out there were about the Ukrainian refugees are bringing bedbugs, but the story took on a life of its own, and it got away from the original messaging that the Russian intelligence services wanted to put out there. But that's one example, firstly, to demonstrate disinformation campaigns run away with themselves sometimes. Secondly, it's a case study in how sometimes the effect on the individual is different than the intended impact. So I think if this is the focus of your studies, I think you're absolutely onto something here, is that there is not enough focus at government level right now on what we can do to increase levels of social resilience to disinformation online, especially on social media, versus a sort of a state level lens of analysis through which we can identify the disinformation and do something about it. There's a disconnect. It's one thing a government telling us, oh, the Russians are putting out a disinformation campaign about this. That's a totally different thing from getting the majority of your population, who now get news off social media rather than watching the news on TV or picking up a paper, to not believe it. I am not paid nearly enough to try and delve into any potential answers as to how to bridge that gap, but the gap definitely exists.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any more questions to our guest speaker?
I should have said, by the way, Itam, that I'm more than happy if anybody wants to follow up via email. I'll be more than happy to field any questions that way as well afterwards, if anybody wants to.
Yeah, it's much appreciated. If there's no question right now, maybe I should use my privilege as the monitor. During the lectures, we are, telling our students that Russia did this, did that, and as you have mentioned, this strategy worked really well, quite a long time for Russia. And as you have mentioned, like the salami slice strategy, they were successful in Georgia. When it comes to Ukraine, they somehow find a way to occupy Crimea and east part of the Ukraine. So I'm really wondering why suddenly Putin administration decided to rely on more conventional strategies rather than the hybrid warfare.
I honestly thought that because of the success of Crimea in 2014, that was precisely the reason why I did not think he would invade the whole country. And even up until the few days before it happened, I was still very skeptical as to what Putin could actually gain by throwing away the hybrid war playbook and instead adopting outright conventional techniques. So I was definitely not alone, were proved entirely wrong by this. I think maybe there are several arguments. Firstly, is that the Crimea example was so successful, it could only work once. That Putin got away with it because he was able to pull the wool over the eyes of the West and claim, with just enough credibility, just enough plausible deniability, this isn't an official Russian sanctioned military operation. However, I don't think that that is an endless playbook. I should have said actually that the use of outright military operations of the sort we saw in Crimea is the exception rather than the norm when it comes to hybrid war. More often than not, we are seeing a perpetual combination of other activities such as disinformation and cyber in particular. The thing is, though, when it comes to thinking about where and when hybrid threats are utilized, those things that you just listed there, especially Crimea, Georgia, I cannot help but think that geography matters hugely when thinking about where and when hybrid threats are manifested. If you think about the infamous cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, and the chaos that Russian hackers rained down on that particular Baltic nation, if you think about, there is precisely the reason why the joint EU-NATO Hybrid Threat Centre is based in Finland, is because proximity to the main perpetrator of hybrid threats is a historical pattern, because of the way in which we often immediately see a disruption in an attempted disruption in the levels of trust in a central government, specifically targeting a minority population who share a linguistic or ethnic kinship with the original, with the perpetrator state. So it's exactly why they targeted the Russian-speaking population of Crimea, the Russian-speaking populations in Georgia, the Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass of Ukraine. It's precisely the reason why countries such as the Baltic nations and Finland, who have Russian-speaking populations close to the border with Russia, are taking this threat very, very seriously. Russia's not the only case study. Look at the targets of Chinese hybrid threats. These are perpetrated against other states, mainly in Asia, states that claim a stake in contested islands, the Spratly Islands, for example. We are seeing consistent levels of hybrid threat waged against the Philippines, for example, by the Chinese Navy. Who have been using electronic jamming equipment placed on unmarked fishing vessels that pull up alongside Filipino naval ships and start to really mess with their electronic signaling. All of this is part and parcel of the way in which, more often than not, I think hybrid threats have to be seen within the geographical region that they a particular leverage is being sought. Sorry, Itam, you're still on mute.
Sorry. There are some questions coming from our students. Just let me... Prakash, if I allow you to ask your question, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yes.
Just thank you for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I joined a little bit later. Actually, just my queries is that what's the impact on daily security management by the the disinformation campaigns by the different interest groups towards the developing countries like Nepal?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. One of the ways in which I think it's interesting to try and map hybrid threat usage is actually seeing hybrid threats not necessarily as always an ambiguous manifestation of hard power capabilities, but also about the way in which it's trying to weaponize soft power. And that's why, particularly when it comes to thinking about Chinese use of hybrid, I think there have been many pieces of literature that have thought about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative explicitly through the lens of hybrid threats, that in order to leverage economic dominance over a region, the aggressive benevolence of major infrastructure projects across South Asia that China has been bankrolling, which, by the way, brings no local jobs with them. All the labor is Chinese. I think actually it can be used. Big, massive infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative can be Trojan horses for wider levels of influence across the society in which they're taking place. Economic benevolence buys political leverage. Political leverage opens up the space for political communications to manifest. And I think that this is one of the ways in which China has been very, very savvy in the way in which it has used its soft power to leverage hard power gain. And therefore, small states like Nepal, I think, are very susceptible to the largesse, not just of China's economy and its political clout, but also, therefore, with that comes with it a whole host of other implications, including adopting Chinese political messaging. So I think it's something that needs to be considered, and that the security management, as you say, in small states in the region like Nepal needs to be actively considered. So I'm glad this is something you're thinking about.
There's another question.
Yes, thank you.
Atina, you are unmuted, so if you want to ask your question.
I think she says she's unable to use the microphone at the moment, she said in the chat. So
okay, sorry.
It's all right, no worries. Hybrid war is mainly operating in the grey space of legislation. How feasible would it be to revise or create legislation in international law that addresses the gaps? I expect countries would be opposed to this as it would limit their own potential for hybrid war. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. The legal, some of you might already be familiar with the phrase lawfare, which has been used a lot in some of the hybrid literature, which is focused upon this, the way in which norm challenging states such as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are deliberately trying to, as I said in the presentation, weaken the norms, the expected behaviors in the international system as a way of weakening the rules that underpin them. And because of the way in which hybrid warfare takes place in the so-called grey zone, the purpose of them is to almost stress test the weaknesses in certain laws. This is why, for example, a lot of the Chinese hybrid activity in the South and East China Sea has deliberately been taking place because of the widespread awareness that the international maritime laws have got so many loopholes in them that they are not fit for purpose. So by exploiting loopholes in laws, the purpose of using hybrid threats is to undermine them and change the expected norms that underpin them. So I do, though, take your second point that many countries would be opposed to creating new legislation to outlaw hybrid war because, and I probably should have made this very clear at the beginning, hybrid war is not a one-way street. It's not a one-way street because we know it's something that the West does against other states too. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that I put a picture of President Ahmadinejad of Iran walking around the nuclear power plant at Natanz, which was, of course, the target of the US Stuxnet attack. And this is one of the reasons why ambiguity cuts both ways. It allows, as it did President Obama, the opportunity to try and take out nuclear centrifuges in the middle of Iran through a cyber attack without having to risk the kinetic use of force against a nuclear target and the obvious human and physical damage that that would have entailed. So I think actually what needs to happen is a bigger conversation needs to be started about whether the values that are at stake here, because there has been a lot of talk about the rules-based international order, that's what's at stake. That's what needs protecting against this salami slicing by competitor states. We need to have a conversation about whether liberal democratic values can only be defended if they are defended aggressively. Now this, to come back to my earlier point about deterrence, do we need to fight fire with fire? Does the West need to overtly adopt more aggressive hybrid threat stances against Russia, China, Iran? Or is that does that simply undermine our own value base from within? Are we doing them a favor by adopting more aggressive hybrid strategies? Right now, I think the ambiguity cuts both ways because the West can take advantage of it, through undertaking cyber attacks of our own, as Stuxnet demonstrated. But also, I think there is an opportunity. It's an important time when liberal democracy is under threat from outside and from within. And we can't just think about hybrid threats as being something that targets critical national infrastructure or territory in a rather detached way. Norms and values are at stake as well. This is why, to come back to Mike's earlier point about disinformation as a hybrid strategy is massively important, because breaking the bonds of trust between a people and its government, between a people and the value system that their country stands for, is eroding the entire fabric of societies if left unchecked. And that's why it's so much more than about trying to annex territory. More often than not, it's not about territory at all. It is about values. It's about the way we think, we act, we operate, we cooperate in the international system. And that's why I'm really heartened to see so many of you trying to tackle these big important questions, which frankly are only going to get bigger as this century unfolds.
Thank you, Andre, for the question. We still have a couple of minutes to go. If there's another question to our guests, happy to unmute you, or if you want to type it, happy to read it for you.
I should just say, one of the great resources, if any of you have want to read up on more of this, the joint EU-NATO Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki. If you visit its website, just Google COE hybrid threats, its publications page is a fantastic resource for a multiplicity of different strategy papers and publications relating to various different forms of hybrid threat, including cyber. So I'd point you in that direction if you want some really incisive commentary and analysis to see what NATO's best minds on the topic are thinking.
Yes, Mike.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you. Just a quick question in relation to what you just mentioned. Do you feel that, or what would be your views in relation to the disinformation campaigns and the social polarization of people in relation to trust to government? Do you think that that could be a specific campaign that would be conducted by another state onto, say, for example, the UK? Do you think that that could be a strategy that's actually actively being used at the moment?
Yeah, I look at America and I worry. I worry deeply, because it is so much easier to sow the seeds of disinformation in an already polarized society, because half the work has already been done for you. A key part of sowing the seeds of disinformation is to pull apart cleavages in a society. That already has been done in large part because of the way in which the MAGA Republican movement has taken over the party, and the entrenched levels of distrust, of polarization in the United States is already, I think, well ahead of anywhere in Europe, which is why I worry more about America than I do anywhere in Europe right now. And it will only get worse. And if I can just be a little bit political for a minute, what worries me is that what worries me more than anything actually is what a second Trump presidency would do, not just in terms of solidarity of the NATO response to Ukraine's plight, but also because of the doubling down on the brutal partisanship that exists, where the questioning of simple truths is now a fundamental component of American political discourse. And that only amplifies the scope for disinformation campaigns waged by foreign powers to be even more effective than they would be, to come back to the point that I heard from a NATO colleague, in societies where there are high levels of media literacy and high rates of government trust in their of public trust in their government. We're not seeing that in the United States. We haven't seen that in the United States for a very long time. And I would be looking over the Atlantic to see exactly where that could be manifest. Those issues you've just identified, Mike, would be manifest most clearly than anywhere in Europe right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Can I ask one last question? If Trump comes to power, do you think that it could encourage Russia or China to be more aggressive in terms of using this strategy?
Russia, yes. China, no. I think because there is clearly a level of bromance between Trump and Putin, and I think Putin would feel emboldened because of the way in which Trump has already mentioned various things, including cutting off funding for Ukraine, his antipathy towards NATO as an organization, his annoyance at the lack of 2% of GDP of defense spending that many European nations do not have. And he clearly likes the sort of Iron Man figure in international politics that he thinks he is. China, though, for Trump is something different. I think China is a real bugbear for Trump. He's very antagonistic towards it because of what he thinks China does to the American manufacturing sector. So I wouldn't lump them both in, but I think Putin, the one person other than Donald Trump who wants Donald Trump to return to the White House, is Vladimir Putin.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your answer. I think we are coming to an end of our webinar, and as we plan for 1 hour. So I would like to thank you for all joining us today, and I want to express my sincere thanks to Andrew for his sharing his insights and expertise and perspective with us. I also want to thank our audience for their active participation and the questions they ask. So by the end of our webinar, I wish you all the best for the future. Stay safe and stay informed. And next to see you in next webinar. Goodbye.